I'm just thankful that you're all able to make the time to join me tonight as we talk about mammal evolution. So I'm going to dive right into the talk here. And the talk is called The Rise and Reign of the Mammals. I want to tell you the story of us, of our deepest origins and evolutionary history and the 325 million year journey that has led to us and the 6,000 other mammals alive today. So some of you may know me or may have read a book I wrote a few years ago called The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs. If so, thank you. Some of you may be familiar with some of the work I've done with dinosaurs, maybe. But certainly for me, most of my career as a paleontologist has been spent studying dinosaurs. That's what I did my PhD about. And that's when I started at the University of Edinburgh about a decade ago now. Shockingly. I mostly started as a dinosaur researcher, but the more I've studied dinosaurs, the origin of dinosaurs, the evolution of birds from dinosaurs, the extinction of the dinosaurs, the more my mind has just wondered, well, what then? What happened then? What came next? And what came next is the mammals. And that's the subject of the new book I have out called The Rise and Reign of the Mammals. This was just published last week and that I'm very excited about. And I'm going to give you a talk here today in about 45 minutes or so. I'm going to breeze through our evolutionary story. And I'm going to tell you about how evolution made a mammal, and then how mammals survived for a long time underfoot of the dinosaurs, and then how mammals took over from the dinosaurs when that asteroid fell out of the sky 66 million years ago, and how that eventually, ultimately led to us, and bats and whales and elephants and all the thousands of other mammals alive today. So, without further ado, I'm going to jump into it. It's 325 million years of evolutionary history in 45 minutes or so. So I think we all have this image in our mind that the dinosaurs had their day and then the mammals took over. And that is what happened 66 million years ago when this 6-mile wide asteroid hurtling through outer space randomly smashed into the earth, caused a mass extinction. T-Rex was there, Triceratops was there. Those dinosaurs couldn't cope, but some mammals survived. And among those mammals were some of our ancestors. That story is told quite a bit in textbooks and in lectures and in TV documentaries and so on. And it's more or less true. But I think what's often not conveyed is that mammals go back way, way, way further. And the start of the mammal story, the origin story of mammals, goes all the way back to when the world looked like this during the Carboniferous period more than 300 million years ago. And this was the age of the coal swamps. This was a time of the biggest, first big jungles in Earth history. There were trees that stretched 100 feet into the canopy, into the sky. And these trees formed vast swamps in the tropics and the subtropics. It was these trees getting buried that formed a lot of the coal that we still mine today in the UK or in the middle part of America where I'm from. This was a world that was so different from our world. There were no flowers, there were no fruits, there were no grasses, nothing like that. These were primitive trees. And they released so much oxygen into the atmosphere that there were dragonflies the size of pigeons, millipedes bigger than humans. And in this coal swamp world, there were other animals too, more anonymous animals. But about 325 million years ago, there was a primitive stock of small animals covered in scales. They walked on all fours, their limbs stretched out, splayed out to the side. They were generally reptilian in their nature. And these ancestral animals split off into two. And one side of the family tree went towards reptiles. The other side would ultimately go towards mammals. Now, fossils from this coal age are prevalent back where I grew up in Illinois, in the US. And there's this very famous fossil assemblage called Mizon Creek. It's just a little bit south of Chicago. And when I was a teenager, there I am with my two younger brothers. We would go and look for these fossils. They are found in these ironstone nodules, these little ovals that look kind of like eggs. These are fossil tombs, and inside, time capsules. There are ferns, there are shrimps, there are fishes, there are jellyfish, there are all kinds of things. And occasionally you find fossils of these little reptilian creatures that were living in the swamps that were starting to make the world their own. And when there was that great split in the family tree about 325 million years ago, again, one side went to reptiles, the other side became what's called the synapsids. And this is what the first synapsids looked like. If you looked at one of these animals, I think you would have just considered it some kind of little lizard or salamander. But this actually was an early ancestor of ours. And what set it apart as it split off from the great family tree of life is that these animals called synapsids, that's their technical name, they had their eye socket, and there's their eye socket right here, and they had another hole behind their eye socket that held jaw muscles, and that helped them have stronger bites than other animals. Well, we still have that feature today. This is that hole in our own head behind our eye socket. That is the one thing, the little subtle thing, the little nuance of anatomy that defined the synapsid line as they split off from the reptiles. And this was a big evolutionary event because one side of that family tree, again, went to reptiles. What that means is that side of the family tree eventually would produce things like lizards and turtles and dinosaurs and crocodiles and birds. The other side of that family tree, the synapsids, the animals with that hole behind their eye socket for big jaw muscles, would eventually lead to mammals. But for the next 100 million years, there were no proper mammals. There were antecedents of mammals, early members of this synapsid line. There are numerous extinct species living during the Carboniferous period and then continuing into the next intervals of geological time, these primitive synapsids, and they were the animals that started to evolve one by one the features that later would come together and define the mammal blueprint. And so, as the Carboniferous turned into the Permian, the next interval of geological time, all of the world's continents came together into a single landmass, the supercontinent of Pangaea. And it was on this landmass that those synapsids, the animals with that hole behind their eye socket for big jaw muscles, those synapsids, they became ascendant. They diversified. They spread around Pangaea. Some of them ate meat. Some of them ate plants. Some of them were big, some of them were small. The supercontinent of Pangaea became a synapsid world. And as these synapsids diversified, again, they were evolving different features of their anatomy, of their behavior, of their biology, of their neurobiology, many things that later on would be inherited by their mammal descendants, including us. So the root of a lot of our distinctive features, the things that make us mammals, go back to this time. And this was a time when synapsids like these thrived on Pangaea. This is Dimetrodon. This is an animal that had a big sail on its back. It had big, powerful arms and legs. They splayed out to the sides. This was an animal that weighed a few hundred kilos. It was a ferocious meat eater. It was a top predator. It was one of the first true apex predators on land in Earth history. It is often mistaken as a dinosaur. You see it sometimes in the dinosaur toy sets, on the dinosaur posters, in the dinosaur books. You'll even see it in a certain film called Jurassic World Dominion, alongside many dinosaurs. But although this thing looks kind of reptilian, kind of dinosaurian, it has this primeval feel to it, it's not a dinosaur. It is one of the first synapsids, and it is an early relative of ours. It is more closely related to us than it is to T-Rex or Triceratops or Brontosaurus. And I think that's just a fascinating fact. But maybe even more fascinating is just what this animal was. It was one of the first big predators in Earth history, and just look at those sharp teeth lining its jaws. But you can see something beyond in those teeth. Those teeth are not all the same. There's some big ones at the front of the jaw that look like they're really good for grabbing food. There's some even bigger ones a little bit farther back on the snout in this area, and then there's a series of smaller ones. These teeth were all very good for grabbing and slicing the flesh of the prey of these animals. But beyond that, these teeth are just very different from the teeth of reptiles or frogs or crocodiles or dinosaurs. You can see these teeth are starting to differentiate. Different ones at the front versus the back. This is the start of the kind of teeth that we have, where we have incisors and canines and premolars and molars, all these different kinds of teeth that together can do many different things. A Swiss Army knife full of different teeth in our jaws. That's something classically mammalian. Dinosaurs didn't have molar teeth. And you're starting to see that all the way back in these very first synapsids. So these synapsids in the Permian, they made that world their own. And they were dominant animals across much of that supercontinent. And they looked like they were poised to continue diversifying, to continue to get bigger and scarier and more varied in their diets and their behaviors. But then something unexpected happened. About 252 million years ago, these enormous volcanoes started to erupt in what is now Russia. And these were not normal volcanoes. This was not the kind of volcanoes we are used to. This wasn't Mount St. Helens or Pinatubo just blowing its top one day. This wasn't the volcanoes of Hawaii or Mount Etna just releasing a little bit of lava. These were mega volcanoes. These volcanoes were essentially canyons, fissures in the earth that opened up and spewed out rivers of lava for hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years. And that lava covered an enormous area of land. Any animals in the vicinity of those volcanoes were in big trouble. But this was a global phenomenon because as that lava came up, it burned through the crust and it released carbon dioxide and methane, these potent greenhouse gases, and this led to runaway global warming, which caused the biggest mass extinction in Earth history. Maybe up to 95% of all species died, including so many of those synapsids that already were very diverse and very common, but looked poised to do even greater things. They were stopped short. But there were some survivors. There have always been some survivors of mass extinctions, and some survivors were reptiles, and some survivors were amphibians. Some survivors were a peculiar type of advanced synapsid called cynodonts, things like Thrinaxodon here, which is well known from South Africa. And these animals were able to endure that horrible extinction because they were smaller, because they grew really fast, they produced really fast. And they probably had hair to cover their bodies, another new innovation of this synapsid line, hair to help keep them warm, to buffer against climate change. And they were able to burrow. They were able to hide. We have amazing fossils. This is one that was described about a decade ago, a fossil of one of these cynodonts inside a burrow next to an amphibian. Being able to hunker down like this helped steer them through this darkest chapter of Earth history. And then as the Earth healed, these cynodonts found themselves in a new world of open opportunities. The Permian had now turned to the Triassic period. It was still the time of the supercontinent, but now that supercontinent was mostly empty. And these cynodonts had the opportunity to do new things and evolve new adaptations in this world. However, there were a few other groups of animals that also found themselves in this new empty supercontinent world. And among these were some small reptiles that became the dinosaurs. So the Triassic was the start of the age of dinosaurs, in addition to becoming the start of the age of mammals. And so you had dinosaurs and mammals, or the antecedents of mammals, both emerging after this extinction, and their fates would be intertwined, really, up until now. Dinosaurs, of course, went big. They were destined for grandeur. Some of them became larger than Boeing 737 airplanes. Others became birds. Others became carnivores the size of buses like T-Rex. These dinosaurs kept the synapsids, the cynodonts, small. But it was in those small niches that those cynodonts became true mammals, that they continued to evolve new features, to adapt to living in the shadows, living underground, living a nocturnal lifestyle to avoid the dinosaurs. Those adaptations helped mammals become resilient. And by about 225 million years ago, those cynodonts that had survived that previous extinction, they became what we call true mammals. And these animals, like this one here, these were the first true mammals. And if you saw one of them, you probably would just think it was some kind of mouse or shrew or some kind of little rodent. They would have been small. You could have held them in your hands. They were covered with hair. They grew fast. They moved fast. They were true mammals. Their fossils are absolutely tiny. This is the reconstructed skull of one of these animals at top using CAT scans of some really important fossils. This is a technology that a lot of paleontologists use now, using the X-rays of CAT scanners to study the anatomy of fossils. Down below is one single jawbone of one of these first mammals, and that is a grain of rice on the screen for scale. That goes to show how tiny these first mammals were, and they had to be tiny because the world was becoming a dinosaur planet. So the dinosaurs kept the mammals small. But again, in doing so, that made mammals adapt. And mammals did some amazing things. Mammals changed their entire jaws. So the ancestors of mammals had lots of bones in their jaws. Mammals simplified that. They turned their jaw into a single bone. All the teeth, all the muscles would attach to that one bone. That allowed these mammals to bite more strongly. It helped these mammals chew their food. In doing so, the full complement of canines and incisors and premolars and molars evolved. And only two sets of teeth, a set of baby teeth, a set of an adult teeth. That allows the teeth of the upper and lower jaw to always fit together really snugly. In things like dinosaurs, reptiles, crocodiles, they're always replacing their teeth. There's no way the teeth of the upper and lower jaw can ever meet properly if they're always changing their teeth. But mammals simplified it down to just two sets of teeth that could always come together really strongly. And that's what we see in our own jaws. In doing so, mammals evolved milk to feed their babies because the teeth took some time to grow in. It's such an intricate set of teeth. So milk evolved during this time. Not only that, but as mammals lost those bones from the back of their jaw, they didn't necessarily lose all of them. Some of them they lost, but some of them they repurposed, and they turned those old jaw bones into tiny little bones that went inside the ear and helped amplify sound. So this helped mammals evolve really keen senses of hearing. And these mammals were evolving bigger and bigger brains. They were becoming more intelligent. They were also becoming really good at smell. Their olfactory bulbs in their brain were becoming huge. All of these things were happening as these first mammals were forced to be small and live underfoot of the dinosaurs, as they were forced to be these almost anonymous, incognito, D-list characters in a dinosaur drama. So the dinosaurs kept mammals small, but mammals became so good at living in those small niches that they kept the dinosaurs big. And what I mean by that is you never saw a T-Rex the size of a mouse, a Triceratops the size of a rat. You never saw that because mammals had those niches. And for 150 million years, mammals thrived underfoot of the dinosaurs. Now we see some signs of these mammals right here in Scotland. And we see them on the beautiful Isle of Skye, a place where I go and look for fossils pretty much every year with my colleagues, with my students. We bring our students out. So it's just an absolutely enchanting place to look for fossils, the most beautiful place in the world that I've ever searched for fossils. Also one of the most challenging places, just given the climate, the rain, the wind, the fact that most of the rocks are along the coast, so we're always battling the tides, but it is really worth it. We bring our students out there. Our students always find the best fossils. This is the prime example of that. This is Amelia Penny in the middle there. And a few years ago, we were on Skye, and Amelia was prospecting, and she discovered the head of a pterodactyl, a pterosaur, protruding from the rock, and that's what she's looking at. And this head led to a skeleton, and we have this beautiful skeleton of one of these flying reptiles, 8-foot wingspan. We just described it a few months ago. We called it Yarkskianak, a Gallic name to honor where it came from. Not a mammal, though, so I won't say any more about it, but this is just to show our students find the best fossils. So we love going out with our students, training them on Skye. And we also look for smaller things. We're not just looking for the dinosaurs and for the big pterodactyls. We're looking for smaller things like mammals. And this is Moji, one of our students, scrutinizing the rock with the hand lens, down, looking just a few centimeters above the rock for tiny little teeth of mammals, because you can find them. And the first ones turned up in the 1970s. And there are not only bones and jaws and teeth of these mammals, but even some skeletons. And these mammals are Jurassic in age, about 170 million years old. These are mammals that lived with the dinosaurs. And when this skeleton was found in the 70s, this is a skeleton at the National Museum of Scotland now, this was the most complete, most beautiful mammal specimen that had ever been found during the entire age of dinosaurs, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. But over the last few decades, even more, even better mammals from the Jurassic and the Cretaceous have started to emerge in China. And they've come from this pocket of northeastern China called Liaoning province, far off the tourist map. This is an area of factories, of rolling hills, of farmland. And it's farmers mostly that in the mid-90s began reporting some incredible fossils, fossils that have become rightly famous. And these are the feathered dinosaurs, the first dinosaurs found with feathers on their bodies. And so many of them are found in China because it just so happened that in the Cretaceous period, there were volcanoes that just blanketed China, this part of China, and buried these entire ecosystems almost Pompeii style, locking in the feathers and the fine details of the fossils. So these feathered dinosaurs have become very famous. They've now even inspired feathered dinosaurs in the new Jurassic World film. But it's not just the dinosaurs that were buried by these volcanoes. The entire ecosystems were, including lots of mammals. And these mammals finally tell us what our family, the mammalian family, was doing during the time of dinosaurs. And I've been really privileged to work with amazing colleagues in China. This is Junchang Liu in the red there, who was one of China's great dinosaur hunters. He was one of my mentors. He sadly passed away a few years ago, but he studied dinosaurs, he studied pterodactyls, he studied mammals, and here he is showing me this mystery fossil of a little mammal just about the size of an apple, covered in fur, beautifully preserved hair from China. And in fact, there are so many fossils of mammals buried by these volcanoes. And not only are all the bones there, but you see the hair, you see soft tissues, you see a lot of details. And these fossils tell us something really important. They tell us that during the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, the time when dinosaurs were dominant, 150 million years, mammals never got bigger than a badger because the dinosaurs kept them small. But although they were small, these mammals were triumphant. They were diverse. They were so good at being small. Some of them were runners. Some of them were scurriers. Some of them were diggers. Some of them were swimmers. Some of them glided on wings of skin, like Myopatagium here. Small, but so complex and rich in their biology and their behavior. Some of them, like Rapenomammus here, it's about the size of a house cat. It was buried so quickly by one of these volcanoes that it was preserved with its last meal fossilized in its stomach here. And that last meal was a meal of a baby dinosaur. So some of these mammals even ate dinosaurs for breakfast. This is such a different picture than what we used to think. Yes, mammals were small during the time of dinosaurs, but they were so good at being small. We need to give these mammals credit. And in being small, they had to adapt, they had to be resilient, and that would come in really, really handy. Now, we found some other mammals. I've been very privileged to be part of field crews in Romania. Back in the Cretaceous period, Europe was a series of islands. Sea level was so high. And parts of Romania still seem like they're islands today, because where we find the fossils, we find them in the beds of these raging rivers. And we do find dinosaurs, and we do find pterodactyls, but we also find mammals. And my dear late friend Matthias Remmer, who was a geologist and a caver in Romania, he was the best fossil collector I ever knew. He had eagle eyes for spotting tiny fossils walking through the rivers. He would dart his hand into the water and scoop out fossils, including this skull of this mammal, which actually led to a skeleton. This is a mammal called Litovoi. It lived right at the end of the Cretaceous. It lived at the same time as T-Rex and Triceratops did in North America. And this mammal lived on an island, and it had a tiny brain. It shows us that these mammals were so adaptable. They reduced the sizes of their brains so they could conserve energy while living on these islands. This is what modern mammals do today. Mammals were already doing this back during the age of dinosaurs. So we need to stop dismissing these Jurassic and Cretaceous mammals as just these tiny little afterthoughts. No, they were integral part of their ecosystems. They just happened to be small, but they were so diverse. But then after 150 million years of mammals living in the shadows, something happened at the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago. And what happened was a 6-mile wide rock fell out of the sky one day, and there was no forewarning. Animals like T-Rex and Triceratops, they would have been there to experience it. They had no idea it was coming. There was nothing preordained about this. This was a piece of space junk just hurtling through the cosmos. And it was traveling like 10 times faster than a speeding bullet. And it could have gone anywhere. It could have sailed right on by the Earth. It could have rustled the upper layers of the atmosphere and just moved on. But instead, it made a beeline for what is now Mexico, and it smashed into the Earth with the force of over 1 billion nuclear bombs put together, and it unleashed chaos, bedlam, earthquakes, tsunamis, wildfires. All the gunk and dust from the impact went into the atmosphere, blocked out the sun. There was a global dark nuclear winter for maybe up to a decade, and the dinosaurs could not cope with that. T-Rex, Triceratops, the long-necked dinosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, all those animals disappeared. Only a few birds survived. But we had ancestors, mammal ancestors, that stared down that asteroid. The dinosaurs couldn't make it, but our mammal ancestors could. Now, what it turns out is that actually mammals almost went the way of the dinosaurs. It seems like maybe 9 out of every 10 mammal species died. So this was not a good time for mammals at all, but it just so happened that some mammals, including our very ancestors, were so good at being small, at hiding, at burrowing, at growing fast, at reproducing quickly, at eating lots of different foods. Those things were the winning hand of cards that allowed those mammals to face the asteroid and come out on the other side. Now, this is a story that absolutely fascinates me, and a huge amount of my research now has turned to studying what happened after the asteroid hit. How did mammals make it through? How did they then make the world their own? Because now imagine this. These mammals for 150 million years had been living, basically shackled by the dinosaurs. They couldn't get bigger than a badger. Now those dinosaurs are gone. The world is empty. The world is open for exploration and new opportunity. Imagine being one of those mammals. And in fact, again, we would have had an ancestor that would have looked out at this new empty world. Now, today, one of the best places to find fossils of the last dinosaurs and then the mammals that took over is in New Mexico. Another of my favorite places to do field work. This maybe fits the stereotype a bit more than Scotland. The stereotype you see on TV of paleontologists digging up fossils and dusting sand off of bones in the desert. New Mexico is Badlands territory, and it's mostly land that once belonged to the Navajo. And I work very closely with my dear friend Tom Williamson, who's the curator in New Mexico. He works very closely with the local tribes as well, and he's had many Navajo students over the years who he's trained to collect fossils on their ancestral land. And more recently, Tom has been working with me to train students. And here in this photo with Tom is Sarah Shelley, who was my first PhD student in Edinburgh, who's now here as a postdoc. And Sarah already in her young career has become one of the handful of world experts on those mammals that took over from the dinosaurs. We find a lot of fossils in New Mexico, and these mammal fossils, they start showing up in rocks that are at most, a few 100,000 years after the asteroid. In geological terms, this is nothing. This is just a hiccup of Earth history. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. These fossils you're seeing here lived within the first few 100,000 years of the asteroid. And you can already see there's quite a diversity of mammals. And we find jaws, and we find teeth, and we find skulls, we find skeletons, we find quite a bit of fossils. And in fact, we were just out there just a couple weeks ago. I was out there with Tom and Sarah and some of my other students and colleagues looking for these kind of fossils. And we found a lot more of them. Now, these mammals that we start to see in New Mexico, there's two things that are important with these mammals. First of all, they are so much bigger than any mammal that ever lived before. Remember, for 150 million years or more, living alongside the dinosaurs, mammals never got bigger than a badger, and most of them were just the size of mice or rats. But within a few 100,000 years of the asteroid impact in New Mexico, we see mammals the size of pigs. Within 1 or 2 million years, we see mammals the size of cows. Mammals are ballooning in size to fill those ecological roles vacated by the dinosaurs. The second thing we can tell from the skeletons of these animals that they are placental mammals. They're not just any old mammals. They are mammals that give live birth to well-developed young. That is the type of mammal we are. That is the type of mammal that the vast majority of modern-day mammals are. So amongst modern-day species, there's a few primitive holdovers, these things called monotremes, things like the platypus and the echidna. They only live in Australia or very close to Australia. Somehow they have managed to endure so much of Earth history. They have survived in this one corner of the world, and they provide us this really unusual glimpse at the early stages of mammal history, when mammals still laid eggs. These mammals laid eggs. So there's only like 5 species of these things. There's also marsupial mammals. These are things like koalas and kangaroos and possums that give birth to tiny little babies that then they raise further in a pouch. And there's 300 some species of those. But the vast majority of today's mammals, most of the mammals that we know, that we are familiar with, the ones that are most important ecologically, are placental mammals, the ones that give live birth to well-developed young, including us, including my son Anthony here as a representative of placental. All these mammals here are placentals. Dogs and cats and rodents and sloths and otters and horses and bats and elephants and whales and Muhammad Ali, they're all placental mammals. These are the mammals that became ascendant after the asteroid. But there's still a lot we don't know, and these are the big questions that drive a lot of my research now. We don't know how a lot of those mammals that lived within the 10 million years or so after the asteroid, how they fit into the bigger mammal family tree. There's a lot of debate. Are these things early experiments in placental mammal evolution that just left no descendants, evolutionary dead ends, founder species that had their day and then disappeared? Or are they early members of the modern groups? Are these things early horses, early dogs, early primates, and so on? We don't really know the answer yet. We're trying to figure that out. We have a big European Research Council project where we're building an enormous data set to figure out the relationships of these early placental mammals. But we do know a lot more about the biology and the behavior and the growth of these first placental mammals living within the 10 million years after the extinction. We can tell through CT scanning, CAT scanning of fossil skulls, using the X-rays to see inside those skulls, the same way medical doctors use X-rays of the CAT scanner to see inside of our bodies. We do that with fossil skulls. We can build digital models of their brains. And Ornella Bertrand, who's a French paleontologist, she works in my lab. She's one of the world experts at using this technique. And Ornella's just led a big paper that's published in Science about a couple of months ago, studying the brains of these first placentals. And Ornella found that their brains, shockingly, were pretty small. These first placentals living after the asteroid got so big so fast that their brains could not keep pace. And their relative brain size, the brain compared to body size, actually decreased from the Cretaceous mammals. So these mammals, to put it another way, they got dumber as they survived the extinction and proliferated afterwards. So it was brawn instead of brains that really helped those first placental mammals survive. And then beginning about 10 million years later, they started to get bigger and bigger brains as more modern types of mammals evolved, which we'll see. Greg Funson, who also works in my lab, he's been cutting up a lot of bones and teeth of these mammals, and he's able to see these growth lines. Some growth lines are laid down once a year, like in a tree trunk. Other growth lines and teeth are laid down every single day. So he can tell how long the early placental mammals developed in the womb before they were born. He can tell how long they ate milk. They drank milk from their mothers before they started eating solid food. And we're in the process of publishing some of this work now, but long story short, Greg's been able to confirm using these techniques that these things really are placental mammals. They are early members of that group that would later give rise to us. But these mammals living in the 10 million years after the extinction, they're getting bigger, they're diversifying, they're starting to eat new foods and move in new ways, and they're starting to spread around the world. They're placental mammals, they're giving live birth to well-developed young. We still don't know a lot about them. They are still pretty mysterious compared to other mammals. And they're not really easy mammals to classify, as we saw. It's hard to put them on the family tree. But beginning in the next interval of time, which is called the Eocene, we start to see mammals that we recognize. And some of the best fossils come from this place in Germany. And it doesn't look like much here, I can assure you that. It's basically a big hole in the ground in the forest. And they used to mine oil. They mined oil shale. And they mined this for a long time throughout both world wars into the 70s, and then it became unprofitable. And there was this big hole in the ground. It was an eyesore. And they wanted to turn it into a landfill. They were going to dump all the rubbish from Frankfurt into this big hole in the ground. But a few local people objected. They petitioned, they went to the government, and lo and behold, this big hole in the ground that almost became a landfill, instead, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And why is that? Well, it's because in those same rocks, those same shales, where there was oil, there were also fossils. And there are beautiful fossils, thousands of fossils of many different things, of birds, of frogs, of lizards, so many things, but lots and lots and lots of mammals. And these mammals were things that basically fell into this ancient lake and were preserved in this pristine condition. And these are some examples. Some of these mammals are so well preserved, there's even little babies still in the womb of their mothers. There's even fossilized placenta here. So no doubt these things are placental mammals. And what's important about these mammals, which are, 50, 55-ish million years old, is they are clearly members of today's modern familiar mammal groups. Some of these things are horses. Some of them are primates. We can easily classify them, but they are still primitive. And the horses, for instance, are only about the size of a miniature poodle. So what we're seeing here is the roots of many of today's familiar mammal groups. And throughout the rest of this Eocene period, these modern mammal groups continued to diversify. And as they did so, they started to do some really peculiar things. And there were many species of mammals living in the Eocene and beyond that you can classify into today's groups that were just, for lack of a better term, they were weird. They were wacky. There were things like calicotheres up here in the upper left, these hoofed mammals. They looked like some kind of unholy cross between a gorilla and a horse. They would have walked on their knuckles with a stupor, and some of these things became really quite big. There were things called brontotheres, the thunder beasts, with these big battering ram horns on their foreheads. And then there were rhinos that lost their horns, but they became so big, their limbs, their arms and legs started to look like Greek columns. And the biggest ones of all were somewhere around 20 tons, the largest mammals that have ever lived on land. But not the largest mammals ever. We'll get to those. But the point is, during the Eocene, beginning about 55 million years ago, we are getting the familiar modern groups of mammals. They appear in the fossil record, although a lot of them are still quite primitive with these poodle-sized horses and so on. But we also get these more modern groups spinning off a lot of wacky types of mammals that don't survive today. We start to see in the fossil record in the Eocene some very familiar types of mammals. We start to see the first bats. And bats are astonishing. They are the only mammals that have evolved powered flapping flight. And by that, I mean the only mammals that have wings. And by flapping those wings, they generate lift and thrust so that they can fly. This is a really unusual thing. The only other animals with bones to ever do that were birds and pterodactyls. And flight was really the superpower of bats. Soon after they emerge in the fossil record, they appear everywhere. Being able to fly allowed them to spread around the world, and they became the first truly global, the first true globe-trotting species of mammal. Meanwhile, around the same time, there were other mammals that looked like this. These mammals started off with hooves. They started off looking like deer, little deer, and they started to change their hands and feet into flippers. And believe it or not, what you're looking at here, this animal, which is just like the size of a big dog, a little bit bigger, this is one of the ancestors of whales. And there is this amazing sequence of transitional fossils that show how these small little animals with hooves that look like baby little deer, like Indohyus here, how through evolutionary time they became bigger, they turned their hands and feet into flippers. They eventually lost their hind limbs altogether. They changed their bodies into aquatic swimmers that could no longer even live on land. This is one of the great evolutionary transitions in the history of life. And by looking at these fossils one by one, almost like a flip book, you can see an animal that looks like Bambi morph into Moby Dick. And that's an incredible story. So some mammals in the Eocene were starting to fly, others were going into the water. Mammals were diversifying, they were adapting, they were changing, they were exploring so many evolutionary possibilities. They were truly making the world a mammal world. The age of mammals was in full swing. There are some beautiful fossils, and I think it bears just showing images like this sometimes. This is a photo from Egypt, from a place called Wadi el-Hitan, not too far from the Great Pyramids. In fact, the pyramids themselves are made up of Eocene age rocks that were formed in shallow water. The rocks making up the pyramids are heaving with fossil shells. And other rocks in the area instead are heaving with the bones of fossil whales. And you can see these whales just littering the desert floor. And it just seems so peculiar. It seems so incongruous. It almost seems like these whales may well just be plonked onto the craters of the moon. You have whales in the desert. But these are important whales. These are whales that still have arms and legs. These are walking whales. They are a snapshot of evolution in action. You can still see their bones in the Egyptian desert today. Now, these whales would continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And some of them lost their teeth entirely, and they evolved baleen, which is like a net that helps them to filter feed. And they culminated in things like the blue whale. The blue whale is alive today, and I think it bears repeating because I don't think it is appreciated as much as it should be. That the blue whale is the largest animal that has ever lived in Earth history. 4.5 billion years of planet Earth. The biggest thing that has ever lived is alive right now. It shares the world with us. We breathe the same air as it. I think that's a glorious fact. And I think that if these whales were extinct and all we had were some petrified bones, we would hold them in as much esteem as we hold the dinosaurs. But thankfully, they are still with us, although they're heavily endangered. So we should appreciate them. We should absolutely conserve them. But the biggest animals that have ever lived are mammals, and these blue whales are so much bigger than the biggest dinosaurs that ever lived. And this just goes to show, this is a colleague of mine, Travis Park. He studies fossil whales. Here he is next to the skull of a modern-day blue whale. Look at how that skull dwarfs him. This whale could treat Travis like we treat a piece of popcorn. These are giant, superlative, extreme animals, and they are mammals. We need to appreciate them. Now, as the Eocene then turned into the Oligocene, the continents are continuing to move apart from each other. And climates are changing too. Now, you might notice on this previous map, I'll put it up again, that Australia is tucked away and Antarctica is tucked away, but there's two other land masses that are also islands, and that's South America and Africa. For many tens of millions of years, they were island continents, the same way that Australia is today. And as they were islands, they incubated their own peculiar mammals. On Africa evolved the elephants, and elephants started tiny. The first elephants, like Erytherium, were just the size of dachshund dogs. And then, of course, over time, elephants got bigger, and they evolved all sorts of different tusks of all different shapes and sizes. Some with long, pointy tusks, others with curved tusks, others like Dinotherium here with tusks that actually flip back on themselves. In South America, meanwhile, there were all kinds of peculiar mammals. Things like sloths and armadillos first evolved in South America, and for most of their history, they stayed there. It was only about 2.5 million years ago that South America finally docked with North America. And some of those animals moved northwards, and other animals from North America moved southward. But until then, South America was an island continent. And in addition to things like sloths and armadillos, there were entire groups of these really weird hoofed mammals that once lived in South America. Now, these mammals, they were first encountered by indigenous people. There are many, many stories of some of the tribes in South America finding these bones, thinking about these bones. What were they? How do we make sense of these? They thought the same things we think when we find fossil bones. Now, a little bit later, a certain Englishman, a certain posh Englishman who was trying to escape the dreary destiny of being a county parson after finishing his degree at Cambridge, a guy named Charles Darwin, showed up in South America on the Beagle. And Darwin met a lot of the indigenous tribes, and Darwin went inland and started to collect fossils of a lot of these things, and they flummoxed him. These were animals, clearly mammals. They had hooves, but beyond that, they seemed like they were a Frankenstein creature mishmash of lots of different types of mammals. A bit of horse here, a bit of rodent here, a bit of elephant there. And Darwin had no idea what they were. And nobody really did until less than a decade ago, when there were some proteins and some DNA that were found in some of these bones. And those things, those microscopic fossils, those molecular fossils, showed convincingly that these weird mammals that have been living in isolation in South America for so long are actually members of the horse and rhino group. So we've just solved that recently with really new tools. So now, in the Eocene and continuing the Oligocene a little bit, the world was pretty hot. A lot of the world was covered in jungles. This was kind of a continuation of what the world was like during the time of dinosaurs. But then temperatures started to get colder and colder. And this had to do with declining amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It had to do with Antarctica getting stranded over the South Pole, which then led to new currents flowing around Antarctica, which basically, like an air conditioner, put the southern half of the globe into a deep freeze and made the entire Earth cooler. There were lots of trends going on in the climate and the environment that led to temperatures decreasing. And as that happened, a lot of the jungles dried up and were replaced by grasslands. And grass was something new. Dinosaurs would have barely ever seen a blade of grass. Grass may have been there right at the end of the time of dinosaurs, but grass really became prevalent after the dinosaurs, and it was really in the Oligocene and especially afterwards in the Miocene period where grassland, savannas, prairies, these vast oceans of grass started to expand as climate cooled. And as they did so, entirely new types of mammals emerged as they adapted to these opening grasslands. And about 12 million years ago, if you were in North America, you could have gone on safari in places like Nebraska and Kansas and Illinois, where I'm from. There were rhinos, there were horses, there were camels, there were elephants living on the grasslands of North America. And we can find their fossils at places like the Ashfall fossil beds, another instance of a catastrophic volcanic eruption, this one being the Yellowstone volcano, that buried entire herds of these rhinos and of horses and camels and other animals about 12 million years ago. You can see these fossils in an amazing museum in Nebraska today. Now, as these savannas opened up, new predators evolved to chase down and eat a lot of the new prey species. And there were some amazing carnivores, thankfully extinct things like the bear dogs or the hell pigs, these extinct relatives of things like dogs and bears and pigs today. But some of these were absolutely ferocious. They were true hell pigs, hell hounds living out on these savannas. Meanwhile, though, in Australia, something different was happening. Australia was an island continent. It continued to be an island continent. The grasslands would come later to Australia. Instead, much of Australia was rainforest during this time I've been talking about. And there's an incredible fossil site called River Slee in the outback, really far away from almost all civilization, where a paleontologist named Mike Archer here, sitting on a box of used explosives, actually goes out and he employs these explosives to crack open the rock, bring the rock back to his lab, and he dissolves the rock, and out of that rock comes these amazing skeletons of mammals. These are not horses. These are not camels or rhinos or primates. These are marsupials. These are mammals that raise their babies in pouches. I barely said anything about them. They seem to be an afterthought in the story, but they survived down in Australia. and they proliferated on this island continent. And they gave rise to just some amazing and bone-chilling creatures, marsupial lions and, Tasmanian devils and Tasmanian tigers and so on. But these are not placental mammals. These are not true tigers or lions or whatever. These things are marsupials, so they are convergent on the placental mammals that lived elsewhere. They evolved similar types of bodies and diets and so on while they were living in isolation. Eventually, though, grasslands did come to Australia as the climate continued to cool. And the climate got so cold that beginning about 2.5 million years ago, the Earth was plunged into an ice age. And this is what we call the Ice Age. And this is when the polar ice cap from the North Pole extended down onto North America and Europe and Asia. And there were pulses where the ice cap was big and it grew and it extended far down. And then pulses where it would retreat. And then pulses where it would grow again and advance again and retreat. Many dozens of these pulses. But during the heights of glacial advance, that ice cap covered London. It covered Edinburgh. It covered Chicago, where I'm from, and New York, and so on. Even like 10,000 years ago, give or take, Edinburgh here would have been underneath a mile of ice. The polar ice cap would have been here. And there were lots of mammals that then adapted to this world, and this is where we get the megafauna, some of the most charismatic mammals of all, woolly mammoths and sabre-toothed tigers being the most famous, but there are so many other types of megafauna that lived during the Ice Age called the megafauna because these things were really big. There were woolly rhinos, there were cave hyenas, there were American lions, there were deer with antlers the size of dinner tables, there were armadillos the size of Volkswagens. In Australia, there were wombats that weighed 3 tons. There were kangaroos that were too plump to hop. In North America, there were beavers the size of humans. There were sloths in South America and North America that were 10 feet tall. They could dunk a basketball if such a thing existed then. And believe it or not, Thomas Jefferson, the third U.S. president, while he was vice president and president, he was enamored with these animals. He collected their bones. He presented research papers on these fossils. He was so obsessed with these Ice Age megafaunas. That is a research paper right there that Thomas Jefferson read out to a learned society less than 1 week after he was inaugurated as vice president, second vice president in U.S. history in 1797. Back in this time, these mammals captured the public imagination the same way dinosaurs do today. We knew these mammals. Our ancestors knew these mammals. Our Homo sapiens ancestors encountered them, hunted them, painted their images on cave walls. There are caves in France and Spain that are plastered with paintings of mammoths, the first human graffiti. We knew these animals, and it was probably because of us that these mammals mostly went extinct, because we hunted them, because we disrupted their environments, because we broke up their population. And that brings us to us. And I am not going to say a lot about humans because I don't want to give you the impression that the entire 325 million year story that I'm telling was some inevitable coronation march that ended with us. We are but a single species of mammal amongst the blue whales and the bats and the elephants and the marsupials and everything else. But we are a pretty sublime species of mammal because around 5 or 6 million years ago, some apes came down from the trees. And this animal called Ardipithecus is a good example of that. They started to walk on 2 legs, although they retained long arms so they could still climb. But as they started to walk on 2 legs, they ventured further out of the forest, and they started to use their hands to make tools. And they evolved bigger brains. And ultimately, these hominin primates became humans. And our species, Homo sapiens, emerged just a few 100,000 years ago. We have been around for such a tiny period of time. And what's fascinating is that we evolved in Africa, but we were one of many human species that evolved in Africa. And over time, some of those species would leave Africa. They would migrate out. They would chase herds of prey. They would migrate as climates changed. This happened many times. So Homo sapiens evolved in Africa a few 100,000 years ago, and when Homo sapiens left Africa, they would have encountered other species of humans living in Europe and in Asia. And these were things like the Neanderthals. And it was only about 40,000 years ago that Neanderthals became extinct, probably at our hands, but also because we bred with them. We were closely related enough to Neanderthals, we could breed with them. So about 3% of my DNA is Neanderthal DNA. And many of you too will have Neanderthal DNA. Really all people other than people that have lived in Africa and their ancestors lived in Africa for perpetuity will have some Neanderthal DNA. What strikes me about that is that for really all of the time of human history until about 40,000 years ago, there were multiple species of humans living at the same time, and many times they were living together. And only for the last handful of millennia, really, has it been us, Homo sapiens, alone, pondering where we came from. And we have migrated all over, though. From Africa, we went out to Europe and Asia, and then to all the continents, to Australia, to North America, to South America. In 1969, we went to the moon. If some very, very, very rich people with too much money at their disposal have their way, maybe we'll soon be colonizing Mars or even more distant planets. We are a remarkable species. But we put so much pressure on the other mammals. We are the only mammal that really has evolved to be able to affect the world and affect other mammals so much. We've killed other mammals by overhunting them or changing their populations. We have created our own mammals and domesticating dogs and cats and cows and so on. And today, climate change, which we are causing, is leading to a lot of pressure on mammals. Now, something like 350 species of mammals have gone extinct since Homo sapiens started globetrotting not too long ago. That's about 5% of all mammals. It may not seem like a big number. Certainly it's not yet at the catastrophic number of one of these mass extinctions I've talked about, where like 95% of species died. But if current trends continue and all the mammals that are endangered today end up going extinct, we will lose something like half of mammal diversity within a few centuries, perhaps. And things like the lion here may enter the fossil record and nothing more, only known as petrified bones. So right now, mammals are at their, or I should say our, most perilous time since some of our ancestors stared down that asteroid. But I'm optimistic because over the last 325 million years, mammals and our ancestors have proven so resilient. We have survived global warming spikes and ice ages, continents drifting apart, sea levels rising and falling, volcanoes, asteroids. We have made it through so much. And human beings, Homo sapiens, us, we are a remarkable species of mammal that has evolved big brains and keen intelligence and consciousness and the ability to work in groups. And we have the power to understand what we are doing to the earth and to change that. And it is by looking in the fossil record, understanding, appreciating, reveling in how mammals have changed over time. I think that perspective is very important as we plot out a better future. So with that, I will close my talk. Thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions now. I should just say the new book again is The Rise and Reign of the Mammals, just published last week. And I think there'll be a link to where you can order the book. Otherwise, you can get it hopefully in any fine bookshop. You can get it on Waterstone's website, Amazon website, anywhere that you like. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be there in person today because of the rail cycle to sign books and chat with everybody. But if you get a book and you want one signed, please do get in touch. I'm pretty easy to find, and we can surely find ways to do that. So thank you very much. Thanks for the attention. Very happy to take any questions you have about mammals, and even if you have some about dinosaurs or about Jurassic World Dominion and what it's like to work on a film. I got a half an hour here, so I'm happy to hear out what anybody wants to know. So thank you, everybody.